I brought my bag up here today. This is my bag. I didn't bring my matching shoes, but my other shoes didn't fit with my outfit. Yes, we have this big tall mirror in our room, and I do stand in front of it and think, does this work or doesn't this work? So whatever, judge me if you want. I know Jeff does it too, right? I mean, yeah. So those shoes didn't work, but this is my real leather bag. I love this bag. I've had it for like probably 6 years, and it was a birthday present. And man, men in bags versus women in purses, totally different story. I tell you what, I got this bag the same time Hannah got a purse about 6 years ago. All I know is over the course of 6 years, I have the same bag. She's had about 12 purses. Okay, and that's fine. We love purses. It's a good thing. She gets to enjoy those. Brenda's probably had more of purses in the course of, I know, for sure. Absolutely for sure. Jeff just can't even count. But this bag, it's amazing. And, I've really, because it's real leather, so it lasts. And I've really begun to appreciate real leather. I don't know if you appreciate real leather. Like, I was never a leather guy. I was like, man, it'd be cool if I was, because it just seems kind of cool to, like, have your boots and put the leather stuff on it with the brush. It just seems cool, so I had to get into that. But anyway, so this bag, it was looking a little old, and I put the, I don't know what they call it, leather butter, probably something cool, but you put on it, and it just, like, comes back to life. And I was like, wow, my bag looks good. I love doing it with my shoes. It's like, they don't just look good as new, they look better than new. And I even got, look at my leather Bible. Man, if I had my wallet matches my Bible, by the way, and my shoes. It's actually embarrassing. I can't wear it all at once because it's just because it's embarrassing. Anyways, that's my bag, and I've learned to appreciate leather because, and I had this. What a dumb moment. I've learned to appreciate little things, which is good. But like the other day when I picked my bag up, I realized why I love leather so much, why I love my leather shoes and my leather bag is if I take care of it, they actually get better with time. Leather actually gets better with time. And I thought, how many things get better with time? And it's like, how cool would it be if everything in life that you did or used or consumed, whatever, just got better with time? Like, how much stress would that relieve off of my life, in your life? Like, every time I pick up my bag now, I think, oh, I don't have to worry about ruining it because the more I use it and I just take care of it, actually, I like it better. And so I thought of some things in life actually get better with time. Not everything, but some things. And so leather is one of them. Leather gets better with time. Wine gets better with time, right? You don't have to worry about it getting old and expired. The longer you hold on to it, the better it's going to be. That's exciting. So wisdom gets better with time, hopefully. Hopefully it's getting better with time. You just grow in wisdom. That's exciting. Sometimes I'm nervous that I'm going to forget some of, like, the things that I've learned from Scripture, like little wise whatever nuggets, and so I write them down. But I realize that I don't forget them. They only get more refined and better. And with time, wisdom grows, and creativity actually grows with time. Unless you lose your mind, then you probably lose your creativity, or you get really creative. I don't know, one or the other. Your 401k gets better with time. Smokers get better with time. Not like smokers, but like the kind that you smoke meat in. They get seasoned, and so food gets better with time. Yeah, keep smoking. Trust me, your lungs will clear up any day now. Just keep on smoking. Just give it some time. It's all going to get better.
Okay, this is way too long spent building that fortress of ideas that I was talking about. Because, like, a listener's getting lost at this point. A listener hasn't heard anything of substance. Hasn't heard any payoff to the build-up. We're 10 minutes into the sermon. This is a long time to be spending just building up to the ideas.
It's all going to get better. Yeah. No, not... Smokers get better with time. Like skillets or like pizza. So the first time we bought a pizza stone, we asked Michael because we washed it a couple times. And we're like, how do you get the grease off of this thing? And we've scrubbed it. And he's like, you're not supposed to wash it. with soap, and you're not supposed to get the grease off. The more it builds on there, the better it tastes when you cook something on it. So we learned. It gets better with time. Relationships get better with time if they're done right. Love actually gets better with time. That's exciting. That if you do it right, that it'll actually just get better and better and better and more precious as you go on with life. And stories also get better with time, don't they? Right? Jeff shared from a podcast he had listened to quite a while ago, basically just proving how any human, if they're asked the same thing, a couple of years apart, they can't remember anything, and they exaggerate like crazy, right? I think we exaggerate our stories, essentially, and we're just not capable of recalling things that well. And so stories tend to actually get better because they get a little more exaggerated over time. And as we get older, we get more stories. And I've learned I love meeting, especially like older farmers, just old ranchers that, they've been there, they've done that, they've been through some stuff, and you just listen to their stories. How valuable is that? Anyways, I was getting my oil changed this week, and we're sitting at J.C. Billion, and of course it's like the tiniest waiting room, and the chairs are so close together, and there's like 5 guys in there. We're just like shoulder to shoulder, and so it's awkward when you're that close in proximity, but you don't talk with one another, right? At that point, you're better off talking. And this one guy comes in, and I could tell he had probably grown up, in farm country, and I was like, he's going to talk, because guys like him always talk. They have great stories. Sure enough, what are you working on over there? It's like, here we go. And so we've begun the conversation, and so I shared, and sure enough, didn't take long. He's telling all these stories. He's telling fishing stories and hunting stories, and he's sharing with this guy next to me who was from like Arizona about how you got to be a Montanan. And so he's sharing all of his manly stories, and then he starts sharing with this other guy next to him about football. They'd apparently both grown up in the same town, and so then they start talking football. And I'm like, oh, this will be good. Because this guy's a storyteller. I'm like, how is this going to go? And it was so funny because they start talking about these football players that came out of their town and how some of them went on to play in some great colleges, and one of them went on to play in the NFL. And this guy's like, oh, yeah, do you know him? Do you know him? Do you know, like reliving his past. And he goes, yeah, all those guys, yeah, that were in the NFL that went on. He's like, I whooped all their butts in high school. And I just sat back and I thought, no, you didn't. No, I don't think so. I didn't tell him that, but you could just tell. And I thought, how funny is it that the truth, how far it comes, and in the truth of his story, I don't know. He's a great guy, super nice guy, but probably is more realistic that in high school, in a situation like that, you could just get pummeled in football, getting sacked all the time. But once you graduate from high school, give it 5 years, and within 5 years, you'll have gone from like just completely getting pummeled all the time to telling people, yeah, it wasn't that great. And then give it another 5 years. You'd be like, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. And then give it another 5 years, and it'll become, I was pretty good. I was pretty good in high school. And you believe it. Give it another 5 years, and you'll be like, man, I was so good. I pummeled those guys. And I kind of think that's maybe where he was at. And just by he told the story. And I found it funny how it's so easy to exaggerate our past, and how oftentimes our past looks a lot better than it really was. And in our present never seems quite what we expected. It's always a little more disappointing than we thought it would be. And the future is always a lot scarier than it should be. But when we look to the past, it's always great. The present, we're always a little bit discontent with the present. Maybe discouraged, disappointed. It wasn't what you thought it would be. And then the future, we're always afraid of what's coming more than we should. And when we arrive, we think, I shouldn't have been so afraid of this or that. And it's funny, I was researching this week because I had heard the statistics, so I had to go find it, and found it on the internet. So as always, we know it's true. But that we have between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts a day. I don't know how they figure that out. I think men have 12,000, women have 60,000. That's probably about what it is. And, so we just think a little bit less. We just ponder a little more. So 12 to 60,000 thoughts a day. 80% of those are negative. How crazy is that? I don't know how they figure that out, but 80% of our thoughts are negative, and 95% of your thoughts are a repeat of your previous day's thoughts. So out of, we'll just call it 40,000 thoughts, 80% of those are negative thoughts, and 95% of all your thoughts are just a repeat from what happened yesterday and what you had thought yesterday. I thought, how crazy is that? But the funny thing is, in general, if you study how the mind works, it actually remembers, even though it thinks mostly negative thoughts, it actually remembers positive thoughts way more than it remembers negative thoughts, in general.
So this actually starts pretty well. He is building a fortress of ideas around things getting better with time, which is kind of a core idea around faith. The idea about faith is the belief that the future can get better, that things can become more good with time as opposed to being less good with time, which means he could be going a number of different directions with this, and it'd be interesting to see where he goes with this. What does he do with this idea about things getting better with time? But this is what building a fortress of ideas sound like, and also using humor to draw people in, which is pretty well done.
Remembers negative thoughts in general. That probably doesn't apply if you grew up in a really bad, abusive kind of a past, but in general, you remember positive events way more than you do the negative. For example, maybe you've gone on trips. We had one 2 years ago on a hunting trip, and the whole time it was freezing. It was rainy, it was snowing, it was miserable, it was freezing cold, shivering for like 4 days straight. But when I think back to it, that's the last thing I remember. What I remember are the great memories we had. It's actually how the memory works. And so if you can just, it latches on to positive things. But in the moment, 80% of it's negative. And I realized that's why when we look back, it seems better than it was. Because you're just remembering the highlights. You kind of forget the negatives. That's why in the present, you're never as content as you should be, because most of your thoughts in the present are negative. And in the future, we tend to be more and more afraid of what's coming. And that's the result, and that's a problem, right? Like if we just let our minds operate that way, we're actually wired to be stuck, aren't we? We're wired to be focused on what's behind, not content in missing what's present and afraid to press in forward to the future. And I was thinking about this week because as we're fasting forward, it's just forward, pressing forward into what this year has, this decade has. What's next for us as a church? What's next for us as people? That one of the biggest problems is we're so focused on the past that we get stuck and we can't move forward. And the result is we end up living in a life where we just replay our past, don't we? We live in our past. That's why when you meet a lot of people that have, they've reached a certain age and they're no longer living stories, they're just retelling stories. And I love telling stories. I hope I've got tons of stories to tell when I'm old, but I don't want to stop living stories either. I don't want to, at what point do we just start settling for replaying the past, living in past success or past hurts and failures, and it robs us of our future. And ultimately, this cycle of even how our mind works is we end up allowing what is behind to rob us of what's ahead. That one of the biggest threats to moving forward is our past.
So this is a perfectly valid point. It's actually one that I alluded to earlier, which is he's making the case of basically faith itself for its own sake as a tool to make life better. So it's a perfectly fine point. I'm curious why that Bible hasn't opened yet. I'm curious why we're a third of the way into the message and Scripture hasn't been mentioned once. I'm very curious to see where he's going to take us to help us talk about this theme, because this feels like a much more modern theme than is often handled directly in Scripture. I'm curious to see where he's going to draw this theme from.
Forward is our past. It's what's behind us. It's the things that we have to learn to let go of, whether they were good or they were bad. We have to learn to let them go so that we can press on and move forward. And I think ultimately, a lot of us end up sort of afraid of the future, honestly, if we think about it, we're afraid of life moving on because we don't think that the future is better. It's not like leather. It's just going to get better and better and better. We're actually afraid that it might get worse. We don't have a lot of hope for it. We're afraid that, man, what's going to happen when I maybe don't have this job anymore? What's going to happen when the kids grow up and move out? What's going to happen when we're not where we're at? And so we hold very tightly onto what we have, and we're actually afraid of the future. And so rather than pressing forward, pressing on, taking hold of that which lies ahead of us, as Paul told us to do. Rather than pressing on and moving forward, we hold on to what's behind us, and we hold on to the present. And there was this quote from Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, and he was doing some interview, and he said this, and it was really good. He says this: always lean into the future. Never, ever lean away from the future. The future will win every time. And how true is that? Obviously, he's talking about technology and business, but our natural tendency is to want to hold on to the past and not lean into the future. But the future wins every time because you can't prevent it from happening. And so what's our posture moving forward? How do you view the future? Is there hope for it, or are you afraid of it? Are you hopeful for the future, just whatever God has for you tomorrow, next week, next year, this decade? Are you hopeful for it? I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful for the things ahead, but if I'm not careful, I can lose sight of that. And it's funny, faith in its very definition, Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's the assurance of things hoped for ahead. So faith really starts with hope, doesn't it? And if you have no hope for your future, your only hope is to relive your past.
Okay, so that's a pretty good payoff, and it's an interesting approach. He's preloading a lot of ideas into your head about hope and how we think about present, future, and past, even bringing some psychology into the picture, which I really appreciate, actually. It's great to hear. Psychology and the church need to join forces. They are both excellent tools for good that need to inform each other both ways. In other words, Christian doctrine should inform psychology, and psychology should inform preaching. How pastors relate to their congregation, because it can help pastors understand the headspaces of their congregation better and to preach in a way that's effective and useful to them. And I appreciate the preloading of the ideas about the future and hope, and how it is better to look forward with anticipation and hope, which is a necessary component of faith. I actually think that that's a pretty good payoff, and I still think he spent too much time building up to it. He spent too much time on analogies that could have been summarized a little bit faster to get to this point. We are 15 minutes into a message, and we're opening the Bible basically for the first time.
Is to relive your past. And I think that's why oftentimes we get so stuck in our past. It is because there's just no hope ahead. There's no hope in front of us. And so our only hope is to relive the good things, the good old days. Talked about that a couple months ago. There's no such thing as the good old days. There's just the good days, and they're ahead. Maybe your past was great. Maybe it wasn't so great, but we have to focus on what lies ahead. And all through Scripture, we've got this list. We're going to continue on in just a second in this chapter. This is the Hall of Faith, and it gives this list of all these people through Scripture that pleased God with their faith, that made the record book, right? They're in the Bible because of the incredible things that God did through them, and that God was pleased by them because they lived a life of great faith, and they were driven by a hope. They were driven by a hope. And I think this is important as we're fasting forward. The rest of this week, maybe as we're coming up on next Sunday, we get to celebrate, that you really spend time with God thinking, what's ahead? What is this hope? What is this hope that we're hoping for? Because if you look in Scripture, there's one thing that is it's like the make or break of all the people in Scripture, and they're struggled with it throughout all of history. Every character are they driven by hope, or are they living back in their past? And so Hebrews 11, it goes on. I'll summarize it real quick, but it goes on, and it explains all these people that lived great lives of faith. You should just go read it if you haven't in a while. It had been a while since I read through it, and it's such an incredible snapshot of the Bible and history and all these amazing people. And so he goes, it says that by faith, it starts off, Cain, talks about Cain and Abel, that Abel, he offered a greater sacrifice, more acceptable than his brother Cain. And God considered him righteous for it. And then he talks about Enoch, how Enoch lived a life of faith, and in faith he was actually taken up into the clouds. So he never died. He just escaped death. It's a good way to go. By faith, Noah built an ark, right? He built an ark in faith. And it goes on and on. By faith, Abraham ventured out looking for a promised land, not knowing where he was going. And then later on in the chapter, I will summarize this, but it says that by faith, these people, it goes on and gives this huge list, but these people overthrew kingdoms. They ruled with justice. They received what God had promised. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Like, wow, that's the kind of life we want to be living. And then it goes on to say, you can't stop there, because it says, but others were tortured, refusing to turn from God to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. And it gives a list of people sawed in half, tortured. Ended not so good for a lot of them. But they were driven by a hope that was beyond this life. And so I wanted to look at this hope. So Hebrews 11, 13, and 15. Follow along with me up there. It says, all these people, these all died in faith. They didn't die having lost their faith. They died having faith. I want to die having greater faith than I started with. They all died in faith, not having received the things promised. They didn't even receive fully what God had promised them, yet died in faith. Why? They didn't receive them, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And then it goes on to say this, but in verse 15, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have an opportunity to return. But as it is, as history played out, because these men had faith and hope, they desired a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And so it's this cool picture. There's so much to learn from that little text. It's one of my favorite little pieces of text, because you can learn so much of it, that all these people that lived great lives of faith, that were focused forward and ahead and moving and walking in all the things that God had called them to do, were driven by a hope. They didn't even get the things God promised them fully. But it said that they greeted the promise from afar. And so, I don't know, you've all greeted someone probably this morning, probably greeted numerous people. When you greet something, you shake its hand. You spend some time with it. You talk to them. You get to know them a little bit. They greeted their future from afar. So God had given them vision for the future and the things promised, and they were so well acquainted with those things, with a life after this life, with a land that God had promised for his people.
Not gonna lie, I kind of wish he would just get into it, because he brought up a really powerful theme, and then he's teasing the audience with it, with this kind of little wordplay.
God had promised for his people. He gave them vision for the future, a hope that drove them, that kept them moving forward. And they didn't look back. And it says, had they looked back at the land they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. Because looking back is the enemy of moving forward. And so, a few points from that text. One, that these heroes in the faith that are so focused forward on what's ahead, one, they're clearly seeking and greeting the future. They have a vision for it. They can see it. They know it very well. Even though they don't have it physically, it's in faith. They greeted it from afar. And then it says this, that they were exiles. They acknowledged that they were exiles and strangers in the earth. That's interesting, isn't it? That in their present, they realized, we're not going to stay here. This earth is temporary. This life is temporary. This day is temporary. This week, this month, whatever the season you're in, we're moving forward and we're not here forever. So there was this discontent in a healthy discontent, not discontent. Let me say that again. They were content, but not complacent. Content, but not complacent. And we talked about contentment a while ago. And that was one thing that I meant to mention, that there's a difference between being content with your life and where you're at and being complacent with your life and where you're at. And so they had this understanding that we're actually strangers. How many of you feel like you're a stranger in the present? Like you're like, I don't know if I even belong here. I feel so uncomfortable with where I'm at. Well, so did they. And they used that to move them forward. And they didn't look back. And so there's another example in Scripture that we're going to look at yet with Elisha. So a more specific example of this man named Elisha. And he's a prophet in Scripture. There's two of them. There's Elijah and Elisha. So if you're as confused as I am, I'll help you with that in just a second. But ultimately, we're going to look at Elisha and how he was called to a future that was greater than where he was at. He didn't settle for the good life he had. He didn't settle for good. He moved into something greater. And so I wanted to look at his life. And he goes to the extreme. Not only does he not look back, but he actually sets his past on fire. Literally. He sets everything he owns on fire so that going back is not an option. He knew this so well. He knew so well that the danger of where I'm at moving forward, the danger of looking back, it's too high a risk. I have to actually burn it all up so that I can't return to it. And so we're going to look at Elisha. And so Elijah is a prophet, and he's actually, God just told him to go and basically call Elisha into his prophetic calling as a prophet. And so the names, to not confuse them, Elijah, alphabetically, J, comes first. S comes second. So if you need to remember which one came first, think of the alphabet. But that still doesn't totally help me, because then I'm going and I'm A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K, Q, R, S. It takes too long. So a better way to remember it, this week I realized Elisha, the younger one, the servant of Elijah. Just imagine Elijah, right, doing his prophet thing, and Elisha speaks up and he goes, shh, Elisha, shh. And he shushes him, shh, shh, Elisha, shh. Now I remember it. It's locked in. So hopefully it'll be locked in for you too. Some of you are just like, he doesn't know his Bible very well if he doesn't know that. Elisha, shh.
So it feels like he's built a lot of themes. He spent a lot of time on this fortress of ideas, but it seems like he spent 25 minutes on it. It's hard to tell where the fortress building ended and the sermon started, but this does feel like the start of the sermon. It feels like we're finally getting into the meat of the story, and maybe all of that setup was necessary, but it seems odd on a 38-minute sermon to spend 25 of those minutes on just leading up to the beginning passage of the sermon. It seems a bit odd.
Elisha. So we're going to read the story, 1 Kings 19, where he's called. It says, so he, this is Elijah, departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him. And he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak on him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah. And he said, let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And he said to him, this weird phrase, go back again, for what have I done to you? What have I done to you? Weird phrase. We'll talk about it. Then he goes on. And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. He killed the oxen and fed it to his friends.
So this is a pretty interesting point that he's making. If you read any Jordan Peterson, he asserts that it is the point of religion to help us deal with the unknown, with its chaos and its danger and its potential, and the known, which is safe but tyrannical and potentially deficient. And I think one of the things that makes Christianity unique is the optimism it sees the unknown with. And I like how he is painting, he's drawing an important theme out of Christianity that you don't hear that often, which is faith is an engine of optimism in what is possible and what is potential. What a lot of people don't tell you is that Christianity is the engine that drove the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is what created the current age. It drove the Enlightenment with its optimism towards the unknown, and its encouragement that people go and explore it, and come back and inform the known with the unknown, come back and change the system, change the establishment with what is learned. That drove things like science. A lot of the great early scientists in the 1500s and in other times were very Christian, because their Christianity was not a detriment to their science, it was an informer of their science, and it was a great benefactor. It drove what is now experimental man, and it created our current society. So much of our thought, so much of our just the way that we think is actually already driven and informed by Christianity. And that is a point that I wish I heard more pastors make. It is why so much of the Bible seems rote and boring, because it's things that we've heard since we were a child, whether we grew up in a Christian house or not.
And fed it to his friends. Not a wise business decision. And they ate. And then he rose and went after Elijah and assisted him. And so, the background, just real quick a little bit. Elisha, we find him hard at work. He's a man of God, hard at work. That's where God calls people. Hard at work, doing their thing, just following God. Doing what they're doing, everyday life. And so he's called out of that place. And so it says that he had 12 pair of oxen. It means 24 oxen. Most families would have one. Okay? Along with that, he's got 12 plows, which he burned and set on fire. 12 plows, 24 oxen. He's very wealthy. He's very successful. He's got a good life. He's a good man, good family with a very, very good life. And that's important as we look at the story. He's doing all right. And he's got lots of servants. Obviously, he's behind the 12th set of oxen. And so he's got 11 other sets with servants that are helping him plow. And he's called. And so this idea of the cloak, real quick, basically what's happening is this passing. So Elijah, it's kind of weird. He basically passes by, throws his cloak on Elisha, and then walks off. And then Elisha runs after him and says, wait, let me go say goodbye to my mother and my father. Like, what's happening there? Well, the cloak was a symbol of the prophetic calling. It was basically a passing on of the mantle. It was Elijah saying to Elisha, hey, you're being called to the office of prophet. You're being called to be a prophet. Elisha knew what that was. He knew who Elijah was. He knew what was happening. He knew that he was going from a life of farming, a good life, plowing, to being called in to be a prophet. And he knew what that meant. It's actually kind of a scary thing.
This is so good. And the reason why I'm making these sermon reviews is because I did not hear this growing up, going to church often enough. And what I mean by that is the simple unpacking of dense, hard to understand passages of Scripture. In particular, the value of the story of Elijah, I never understood it. It always seemed just so strange and alien that I never could wrap my head around what made it so important. But if you talk to Jews who know their scriptures, like religious Jews, Elijah seems paramount to them. And even in the Bible itself, it speaks so highly of Elijah and Elisha that it always baffled me. And the simple little statement of unpacking what it meant to have the cloak wrapped on them, and that little statement at the end is so very important. It was scary. It is so hard to understand the emotional impact on some of these scriptures because we don't have context. Maybe he did need to spend 25 minutes building context for this scripture. Maybe some more of that context will come in handy. But just these small statements of this is what this short statement meant, this is the value and importance and power laden behind it. And that's what justified the crazy reaction that followed.
It's actually kind of a scary thing. And it meant giving up the life he had to something new. And so his response is he drops everything he has. He drops it. The opportunity walks on by. Like when opportunity hits, are we ready to say yes to it? Because Elisha was. He was ready to say yes. And so he runs after Elijah. And he says, let me go back and take care of some things. And he's giving up. He's committing to giving up his life. You know, it's easy to give up. It's easy. It's not easy. It's hard to give up a past when your past is hurt and broken. You know, it's easy. We still have a hard time letting go of that, of a rough past, of a rough life, and moving into something greater. It's still difficult. But it's even more difficult to give up a life that's really, really good and comfortable into something greater. And he knew that serving Elijah meant probably sleeping in caves, being homeless, wandering around. Like he was going from living life large to sleeping in caves with a smelly prophet. Okay, but he knew what this was, and it was a great calling. And so then the first phase is he's called, and then the second thing is he's questioned. That line, let me kiss my mother and my father, and then I'll follow you. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? Like, what have I done to you? Like, you know, Elijah's having a bad day. I don't care. Do what you want. Go back. Do what you want. I don't know. But that phrase, if you study it, it's an idiom. It's a figure of speech. And it basically means what's stopping you. And I think that's the proper way of reading it. Elisha says, can I go back and say goodbye? And he says, of course, go. Like, I'm not. What's stopping you? What's stopping you from letting go of your past? And so he goes on. It also shows us that he had to choose the calling. See, Elisha could have said, no, I'm not going to do it. It was up to him. It was his choice. He could have chosen it, or he could have just kept doing what he was doing. Elijah says, it's up to you. He says, go ahead, do what you want. So he goes back, and he kisses his father and his mother goodbye. A kiss was a sign of allegiance. It wasn't just, let me go say goodbye to mom and dad. I'm going to really miss them. Let me please just say goodbye. It was a sign of allegiance. So what he's doing is he's going back, and he's telling his parents and his family, I'm no longer going to be a part of this way of life. I'm moving on, but in a respectful way. And then he burns everything to the ground. But here's the point. One of the points is that you need to burn your past, but don't burn your bridges. See, he leaves very respectfully. And the way you leave one season of life is how you enter the next season of life. So I think we could take some good notes.
So this isn't wrong per se, but I do feel there's a missed opportunity here. What I think a lot of people struggle with is making small sacrifices in their personal life to make their lives better. You know, Jordan Peterson would tell you to clean your room. You know, that is a small sacrifice that makes your life better. I think that it would be an excellent time, and that time is rapidly passing. Like, this practical application just kind of leapt out at me, and I'm surprised it didn't make it into his sermon. If Elijah was willing to go and burn his entire past in an extreme act of sacrifice to make a better future, what can you do in your own life that doesn't have to be that extreme? If he's willing to go to that extreme, what is stopping you from doing the small things that you need to do to make your life better?
Season of life. So I think we could take some good notes from Elisha and how he leaves his past behind. And he does it in a very healthy, respectful way. He honors his parents. He kisses them goodbye. And then he lights everything on fire. And I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He would have been a better steward, wouldn't he, if he had just sold the oxen and sold the plows and used all the money to give to his family or to take with him on the trip? But he just lights it on fire. Why? Because it's a sacrifice to God. His past literally becomes a sacrifice to God. And he gives it, and then he feeds the whole village. He would have fed thousands of people. Think about buying a cow. How many people that can feed for how long? Imagine 24 oxen. There's a massive, massive feast. And he uses all of his plowing equipment to stoke a fire to burn the animals. Like the oxen, I could understand. Buy more of those. But the plows, like hang on to those. Something. Sell them at the auction. I don't know. But he burns it all up simply as a sacrifice to God. And so there's this question, what is stopping you? As we move forward, what are the things that are stopping us is really the question. And I think Elisha, he understood the future that was ahead, and it was great. See, he wasn't being called to a better future. It was not going to be easier, wasn't going to be more comfortable, but it was a greater future. God's calling us into greater things, not necessarily better things by our standards. Things might not seem as good and comfortable, but that doesn't mean you're not walking in the calling, that you're not having an impact. It was a tougher life. And it's really difficult to leave behind something good to take hold of something great. That's the biggest struggle I think we face.
This is why I am infuriated by preachers that posit that the Bible speaks for itself. And what I mean by that is basically I just kind of preach the word, describe what's there, and just let it be what it is. I don't need to explain anything else. The Bible needs explanation. It needs unpacking. We do not live the way that they did. We do not have the same idioms. It is a different culture. It is a different time. People spoke differently. They had their own idioms. I want to know what the idioms are and what they would mean today, because he just took a very short span of verses that has a lot of confusing interactions that you wouldn't understand coming from a person of our culture, and he broke it down and he made it real. That interaction now seems more real. It makes more sense. It painted a picture of a guy just doing his job, at work, kind of a business leader, right? You can see this. You can see a business leader, maybe somebody who runs a small business, does a lot of farm work, is kind of a farmhand. Like we know some people like this. That makes it more real. And basically, a religious leader comes by and drops his cloak on him, which is a symbol that means you're next. You're called to be something completely different. And now you have to drop everything else and come go do this. Which is echoed very, very strongly by Jesus going up to his disciples and saying, drop everything that you have and come follow me. That makes so much more sense. That adds richness and context. And I love the whole idiom of, what's stopping you? Go do it. Make it happen. That makes the relationship so much more real, and that adds character to Elijah and Elisha. It makes it that it adds that master and student dynamic where the master is kind of trite and has high expectations and is putting the student on edge a little bit and kind of I don't know, you just see that dynamic in so much more of a real way when those idioms get translated. Language is not the only thing in the Bible that needs translation. Ideas need translation. Thoughts need translation. Because we do not think the same way as human beings than we did 4,000 years ago.
That's the biggest struggle I think we face. Letting go of good opportunity for the great things that God has in front of us. The difficult things, but the great things. And so what's stopping you? Elisha knew it was his past, and he didn't want to risk going back to it. When Elijah got smelly and cranky, and they were sleeping in a cave, and had to go murder a bunch of false prophets or whatever, and he didn't want to look back to his past and risk going back, so he burned it all. No retreat. He burned his plan B. 2 sermon titles for today. The main one is Kiss Your Past Goodbye. Past. Kiss your past goodbye. And the second one is burning plan B, ultimately. You can burn up plan B, burn the plows, burn whatever the other option is that your tendency is to fall back on. You gotta cut the tie. You gotta cut the ties of your past You got to kiss your past goodbye in the proper way, but kiss it goodbye. And there's another story I'm going to share real quick. And I'm just going to read an account of it. But it's the Spanish explorer, Hernando Cortez. Maybe you've heard of him. So the story's not about him being a good guy, because he didn't do necessarily good things, but it's about his tactics. Maybe you've heard this story shared in a leadership conference or something like that, but it's a pretty incredible story. And it's very similar to what Elisha did, and I think what all of these heroes of faith did to eliminate option B. And I'm just going to read this. I looked up a lot of versions of it to make sure I got a good version of it, but this is from Paul Waghorn, some guy with a blog, and he had the best version that I think was the most accurate. But I'm just going to read it. It says this, that in 1519, maybe you know the story, the Spanish explorer and conquistador Hernando Cortez decided that he wanted to seize the treasure that the Aztecs had been hoarding. He took 500 soldiers and 100 sailors and landed his 11 ships on the shores of the Yucatan. Despite the large army under his command, he was still vastly outnumbered. It was like thousands to one, by a huge and powerful empire that had been around for 600 years. Some of his men were unconvinced of success, rightfully so. They were terrified. Many other people had attempted this and failed. And being loyal to Cuba, they tried to seize some ships and escape to there. Cortez got wind of the plot and captured the ringleaders. He wanted to make sure that the remainder of his men were completely committed to his mission in quest for riches. So he did something that seemed completely insane to his people. Cortez gave the order to scuttle the ships, to sink the ships. He gave them an order. To scuttle the ships meant to basically fill them with water and let them sink. Some versions say burn the ships. It's a pretty powerful phrase, burn the ships, but he actually scuttled them, he sank them. Kind of the same idea, so who cares? But he gave them this command when his men were terrified, when they were up against an army vastly outnumbered, he knew what he had to do. He had to get rid of the ships. He had to get rid of every option of retreat. There's no going back. Scuttle the ships, sink the ships. His men resisted, obviously, wondering how they would even get home if they survived. And his answer was, if we're going home in their ships. The path forward was nothing but complete success and victory. Failure was not an option. They weren't going back. And so I think that it's important, whatever it is in our lives, worship team, you guys can come up as we close out. Whatever it is in our past that's keeping us from moving forward. And for some of us, it's past hurt. It's past bitterness. If you have bitterness in your life, you got to light that on fire. I love how Erwin McManus says this in his book, The Last Arrow. He says, you need to set your past on fire because it's burning up your future. And if you got bitterness, tell you what, it is burning up every bit of joy, of contentment, of clarity in your life. So what are the things you need to burn up, that you need to start on fire? Maybe it's past hurts. Maybe it's forgiving someone. Maybe it's bitterness.
Bitterness is an odd point to draw out of the text and the current situation. It's not bitterness that... It's just that's shoehorned in. That doesn't fit here. The theme that he's been building up to is building a better future. And while, yes, that's related to letting go of the past, bitterness, that's not really what the point is here. The point is value a better future more than you value the way things have always been done, which is an excellent point to make. Why you have to shoehorn bitterness in here? That seems really odd.
Bitterness. Maybe you're just bitter how you grew up and you didn't have the opportunities other people had. Maybe you grew up with abuse. Maybe you grew up and you had an amazing life. Like, and you relate to Elisha, where you grew up and everything was really, really good. And the thing you need to let go of are the good things. To take hold of the scary things, the great things, whatever God's calling you into. And I don't want us to think that this means we just need to change our job and sell the business and burn the building down. Light the trucks on fire. It's an offering to God. I wouldn't recommend that. you'll probably end up in prison. I don't know. But that's not what I'm saying. And I think there's this discontent that we unintentionally create in ourselves when we have messages like this, that God's calling you to something greater. Well, suddenly that must mean that you're not in something greater right now.
Again, I'm going to go back to my previous point. I wish that he would draw a connection between the extremity that the prophet faced and the minor cases of extreme behavior that you can use to improve your life today. Here's a really, this just leapt in my mind, and I'm surprised it didn't leap into his. Maybe you were struggling with phone addiction. Maybe you need to uninstall Facebook. Maybe you need to uninstall and remove and cut out from your life the things that are causing you to not live in the fullness of life. That is a modern extreme. That is extreme for your life. And maybe that would make other people feel uncomfortable. Same with, burning your plows. I'm sure that made other people uncomfortable too. It's just those practical, there's such an odd shift from kind of this beautiful theme of kind of burning your past to live a better life, to live a greater life, to live a higher calling, from bitterness. It's just so it's so loosely related. They're just so tenuous.
Not in something greater right now. And I don't want us to leave thinking, well, I must just change my job. I got to change my whatever it is, my career. I think it's just a small step. We've received greater. We've received the Spirit of God. We've received the thing that all of them were waiting for. There's still more to come. We still have things to look forward to. We still have the hope of being in eternity with Him, coming back one day, spending eternity in the city that's prepared for us, the Garden City. But I think most of us, what it is simply just the next step. What is the next step that you need to commit fully to and stop retreating back to whatever the old ways were? Whatever your old thinking patterns were, whatever your old fears were, whatever the old addictions were, whatever it is that's holding you, you got to cut it off and just take a step. You don't have to completely change everything. Where you're at right now is where Elisha was, just doing his thing, and that's where God called him to just take the next step. For him, it was accepting a mantle to then go and serve Elijah. For 18 years, he served Elijah. There's no record of him doing anything fantastic for 18 years. He was just a servant. And for some of us, I think maybe we're not willing to humble ourselves like Elisha did. Not only did he give up everything, but he had to humble himself to be a servant. He went from the CEO to the servant. Are we willing to do that? What's the next step? It's as simple as that. What's the next step? And commit fully. Commit fully to God. That's what this fasting is about. That we're fully committed. We're just stepping in and pressing in, moving forward, and see what God will do. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to close out.
So this was a solid message. After reviewing several sermons, I've seen messages that were not messages, that were just talking aimlessly and rambling for a long period of time. This was not that. This was a solid message that was unpacking a great theme in a solid way. I learned from this message, and I'm actually pleased with it. It is a good message. It builds up for a little too long with stuff that's not entirely necessary, which just kind of pads out the length of the message unnecessarily, and you do get lost in the build-up a little bit because you're not quite sure where he's going with it, because he doesn't ground it in the biblical theme early enough. We don't really start getting into the core meat of the message until what feels like 20 or 25 minutes into the message, which feels very odd. I feel like he should have started with the theme of Elijah earlier and maybe even foreshadowed some of it, so we kind of knew what we were getting into, because he does do a great job of taking a very small section of Elijah and making it the huge and important theme that it is. And towards the end there were just some missed opportunities, some great potential paths of application that help people think about the theme and applying it to their lives a little bit better, that could have been terribly useful for people. So there's a couple of missed opportunities, which are not the end of the world, but it was a good message, and I appreciated hearing it.